British Prime Minister Theresa May has signed a letter invoking what is called Article 50. That formally starts the process for the country's exit from the European Union. May spoke earlier about the process. Watch.
This is an historic moment from which there can be no turning back. Britain is leaving the European Union. We are going to make our own decisions and our own laws. We are going to take control of the things that matter most to us. And we are going to take this opportunity to build a stronger, fairer Britain, a country that our children and grandchildren are proud to call home.
And joining us right now, Steve Hilton is a former associate of David Cameron. Steve, 52% of British voters chose to leave the European Union. Has the move gained more support, you think, since the vote?
It's about the same. There's been some talk from those who were on the other side that there's been buyer's remorse and people, when they've seen the actual outcome, have gone off the idea. That's not true. The support remains steady, if anything, a little bit up. But there's not really been any major change. It's still a very divisive issue in the UK. It's funny watching Theresa May make that statement because, of course, remember, she was on the other side of the argument. She actually was not for Brexit. She didn't think that it was a good idea. She campaigned against it. But now she's doing a great job, I think, of leading the process. And I think we can be proud of how she's handling it. I think there are two things to think about. First is the actual process of leaving, the negotiation. That's going to be really complicated because over nearly a half-century now of being entangled in the EU lawmaking and bureaucracy itself, so much of what goes on in the UK is driven by the EU. Up to 70%, according to some estimates of the regulation and the law, it comes from the EU. So just getting that untangled itself is a very complicated process. The big questions are, and this is really the debate in the UK right now, does the UK still have access to the single market? And will the supremacy of the European court, the judicial system, still remain over the UK? And it seems to me the answers to those questions have got to be no.
Right. I mean, why would they allow them to have access to the single market and not be part of it?
So it's a kind of, I think that's a silly debate, because one of the main issues, as you pointed out earlier, in the campaign, in the debate, was about immigration. And one of the rules of one of the founding principles of the EU is this notion of free movement, that a country doesn't have control over its borders. So if that's the deal breaker, which it clearly is, then the single market point is just a moot point. Same with the sovereignty. It was all about national sovereignty. That was what the debate was about. There's no way that Theresa May is going to agree to anything that leaves the European court system superior to the British Parliament. That was the whole point. So in the end, but that all has to be negotiated. There's talk of special access for auto industry and all that kind of stuff. But for me, the big point, and this is what I argued in the campaign, was that all of that is actually less important than the fact that outside the EU, the British government will be able to implement policy that benefits the British economy, that actually makes Britain this kind of pro-enterprise, dynamic economy that it can compete globally, free of all this regulation. And so the real point is what happens after Britain has left, which is the opportunity to actually reinvent Britain as a new economy for the 21st century.
I mean, Britain can manifest its own destiny right now. I saw this whole referendum had to do with a nanny super state dictating terms to the British people. It made the British people its subjects, and that's something the British were used to, especially given their long history. Now, I think Theresa May has done a great job. She said Brexit means Brexit. She hasn't wavered. We saw actually that this 2-year timetable may not be accurate. We think it could go longer. It could be 5 years, maybe 10 years. We even had the vice president today of the European Parliament said, we're talking about it being 5 years. So would you think,
it's 2 years.
But can I just make a
do you think that could happen?
David, you're completely right. And by the way, there's a general election in the UK in 2020.
Right.
There's no way that Theresa May wants this to go beyond. And so somehow or other, a line is going to be drawn. And she's already said she's open to the possibility of there's no deal being done, and we're just going to leave.
What does it do to the UK's economy, though, in that 2-year window? Because there are money issues related to extracting itself from the EU. Will Britain pay the European Union money? Farmers in the UK are owed money by the union. I mean, these are all issues, but then lay over that the uncertainty of
Yes.
what happens at the end of that 2-year period.
That's true, and it's also argued by the EU that Britain owes the EU money for obligations, for example, pensions,
Right.
pension obligations for people in the EU, which
And that is
so there's a lot of complexity. But even if you look at all of that, the overall amounts of money are pretty trivial compared to the size of the economy. Even if you look at the trade issue and whether you have access to the single market, and let's look at the worst case scenario, which is that Brexit happens without a deal, they can't agree, and Britain just leaves. Well, what happens then? Britain is just another country like America, like Canada, part of the World Trade Organization rules. And so that means that tariffs will re-emerge on certain goods and sectors. But those tariffs are tiny compared to the opportunity that comes from being able to control the borders and the employment policy and taxes and investment in different areas of the country. Actually, I think it's too much sort of talk about the deal itself and not enough talk about what Britain can do free of all these constraints.
Right, and that will be the conversation once they get through this. I mean, the process of invoking Article 50 cannot be reversed or abandoned without unanimous agreements of EU states. That's also interesting. So what's the next step?
Well, the other thing, actually, Mira, is to bear in mind is that the EU itself doesn't want to make this process look easy or fun or pleasant, because it doesn't want anyone else to leave.
Of course.
Right,
Yeah.
but what about
Mirroring life in the European Union, not easy, fun, or pleasant.
Well, yeah, but this leads to a big overall question about Scotland and what happens, because there was a referendum under Prime Minister Cameron that actually they voted to stay.
Yes.
Now they're talking about leaving. So what is your take on that?
That's a really interesting one, and that's a serious point, because the Scottish government can hold a referendum on its own, but it's not legally binding for the whole of the UK. So that's an interesting negotiation that's going to happen. But to me, the most interesting thing about that was that the British people generally, as they voted in the referendum, want to keep the United Kingdom together. But recently, after this debate over Scotland and Brexit, a poll found a big majority in the UK saying, actually, if it comes to it, we think that Brexit is a higher priority than keeping Scotland within the UK. So that's an interesting shift, that they're adding independence from the EU, even if you have Scottish independence too, is better. That's a price worth paying for leaving the EU. That's an interesting change in public opinion.
It really is. Steve.